Let me finally invite Deepak Nayyar, who is Emeritus Professor of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and he has a very long and distinguished career, spent some time teaching at Oxford, but also has had a consistent presence and involvement in government, has served at one point as the chief advisor to the Indian government, so let me welcome Deepak to make his remarks. And Deepak is talking on emerging economies and the global crisis, lessons from and prospects of China, India, and Brazil.
At the outset, I'd like to thank HKUST for the invitation to be here this morning. And I'm very pleased to be here at the beginning of what is a very special initiative supported by Ernst & Young, because in a sense, it is about the future of the world economy. Now, in my presentation this morning, and forgive me, I'm not going to use the PowerPoint. I'm going to rely on the old-fashioned spoken word. I intend to pose 4 questions and provide brief answers. First, why was the impact of the financial crisis and the Great Recession that followed in its aftermath less adverse on some emerging economies and some parts of the developing world, and why was their recovery significantly faster than industrialized countries or developing countries? Second, can emerging economies then drive recovery and turn into engines of growth for the world economy? Third, if not, and my answer is no, then how might developing countries address the problem in their respective national contexts? Not simply to mitigate the impact of the persistent recession, but to contemplate insurance, as it were, in the future. Fourth, I will consider the potential for and the constraints on growth in emerging economies. And in conclusion, I will do some thinking about India, the challenges that face India, and I hope that we can continue that in the panel discussion. Now, the adverse impact of the financial crisis and the Great Recession on output and employment in the industrialized world and in the transition economies was substantial, while the developing world did not fare as badly as might have been expected. Some market economies in the European Union, we know, particularly Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, as also the transition economies in Europe, are in deep trouble. These countries have large external debts relative to foreign exchange reserves, or domestic financial vulnerabilities in the private sector, which have been shifted to the government sector through bailouts. But there is a sword of Damocles that hangs. Many of the high-income emerging economies were also adversely affected. South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, as also Mexico and Turkey, which were highly dependent on the US and the European Union for their manufactured exports, were hard hit to begin with. Similarly, Chile, Malaysia, and Thailand also experienced a contraction in GDP, partly as a consequence of the sharp decline in their exports. In contrast, some large developing countries, in particular China, Egypt, India, Indonesia, and Nigeria, turned out good economic performances in the aftermath of the crisis, while Argentina and Brazil, the bad boys of the past, did not fare too badly. Apart from these large emerging economies, surprisingly enough, some parts of the developing world, such as South Asia, North Africa, and much of sub-Saharan Africa, fared better than might have been expected. But that is not all. The growth performance of the least developed countries, the poorest in the world, was surprisingly robust. In some, growth slowed down everywhere, but remained positive in some countries and some regions, particularly the emerging economies. Now, given the diversity of countries in the developing world, it is difficult to provide a general explanation for the unexpected resilience of some economies following the global crisis. But it is worthwhile, I think, to focus on three emerging economies: China, India, and Brazil, which is what I intend to do, that weathered the storm. The impact was less adverse, the recovery was faster. Now, it is not as if these three were immune from the crisis in the world economy. The impact on some sectors of these economies, particularly those that were export dependent, was devastating in the short run. Yet, in retrospect, they turned out to be surprising exceptions. Their experience, I think, carries lessons for other emerging economies in the developing world, which is worth contemplating. Now, the impact of the global crisis was less adverse for four reasons. First, the initial conditions before the crisis were supportive. There was macroeconomic stability reflected in the fiscal situation, moderate inflation, large foreign exchange reserves, combined with economic growth, which provided structural flexibility both at macro and at micro levels. Second, the financial liberalization was restrained. Integration into international financial markets was calibrated, and the domestic deregulation of financial sectors was paced. Third, the safety nets for the poor and the vulnerable, even if limited, were in place. China has always had social protection. India had the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. Brazil had Bolsa Familia. Fourth, the economic size of these countries, in terms of population, if not income, meant that domestic consumption was a countervailing force, particularly as economic activity for significant proportions of the population was not quite connected with the world economy. Their economic recovery was also significantly faster for three reasons. First, these countries adopted expansionary, countercyclical macroeconomic policies which are almost Keynesian and most unusual until now in the developing world. What is more, the response to the crisis was fast and effective. There was a massive fiscal stimulus in China, nowhere near as much as in India or in Brazil, but all three were significant. Now, the existing macroeconomic situation that was stable and the presence of public financial institutions in all the three countries made the task much easier. Second, the size of the home market made a difference. The increase in aggregate demand came in significant part from segments of the population with a high propensity to consume, mostly poor people, which was transmitted to the real sector of the economy. Thus, domestic consumption drove recovery and sustained growth. Third, their financial sectors were less fragile and more regulated than elsewhere, did not absorb scarce resources from stimulus packages or recapitalization bailouts, so that easier monetary policies meant lending for investment to the real sector in these economies rather than the creation of financial asset bubbles, yet again, as happened elsewhere. Now, the reasons underlying the resilience of other economies, the emerging economies and developing countries that fared better were probably similar. The combination of factors that could not have been the same because of differences in size and circumstances of countries. The relative importance of underlying factors would surely have been different. Yet there can be little doubt that initial conditions, policy responses, and domestic demand shaped resilience, shaped recovery, while prudence in deregulation and liberalization of financial sectors limited collateral damage. Fiscal space available to governments also made a difference. The significant increase in the share of developing countries in world income and world trade, which was clearly discernible in the 2000s, also meant that there were some external markets and some external resources other than in the industrialized countries. And I think it's almost certain that robust growth in Asia provided support to this resilience. Now, China, India, and Brazil are large. Most small open economies in the developing world do not have similar space or similar flexibility. Yet, the experience of these economies suggests some lessons for everyone. Hasten slowly with capital account liberalization, exercise restraint in the deregulation of domestic financial sectors, stay prudent in macro management of the economy, use counter-cyclical policies if needed, and create social safety nets for the poor and the vulnerable. Now, in the wider context, we should certainly recognize the resilience of China, India, and Brazil, but I think it would be a mistake to conclude, as some people did, that these countries can drive the process of recovery in the world economy or turn into engines of growth. Rapid economic growth in lead economies elsewhere drives the world in providing markets for exports, resources for investment, finances for development, and technologies for productivity. The classic example, Britain in the 19th century and the United States in the 20th century, validate that. But if you think of China, India, and Brazil together, before the crisis, they accounted for a little over 10% of world GDP at market exchange rates, and maybe 25, 27% of world GDP in PPP terms. Now, given this reality, economic growth in China, India, and Brazil can provide only a limited stimulus to growth elsewhere, as in large part as markets for exports. But these countries are not engines of growth, at least yet, in other dimensions. At best, they are complements, not substitutes, which could provide stimulus in their respective regions as the old engines of growth slow down. Now, even as markets for exports, there should be some mechanisms through which economies can transmit their growth dynamics to the rest of the world. India and Brazil do run large current account deficits, but given their share in world trade, cannot contribute much to recovery in world demand. China has a far larger economy and a far larger share of world trade, but it has a big current account surplus and a massive balance of trade surplus. In principle, China could stimulate growth elsewhere if it reduced its trade surpluses, its current account surpluses. But even this transformation, I think, cannot suffice. The import content of Chinese exports is 50%, while the import content of domestic consumption is only about 10%. It would seem that China is a major importer, but not a major market. Thus, other things being equal, a 100% shift in the composition of aggregate demand from exports to domestic consumption would reduce Chinese imports by $40. China cannot turn into an engine of growth for the world, even as a market for exports. It would then be essential for developing countries, if the recession persists, to address the problem as best as they can in a national context. Now, ironically enough, I think there is an opportunity in this crisis for emerging economies in terms of rethinking policies and rethinking development. First, there is both need and opportunity to reflect on macroeconomic objectives and macroeconomic policies. Such a rethinking must begin by redefining policy objectives. In the short term or in crisis situations, the prime concern should not be the stability of prices alone. The stability of output and of employment is just as important. In the medium term or in normal times, the essential objective of macroeconomic policies cannot simply be management of inflation or elimination of macro imbalances. It should be just as much, if not more, about fostering employment creation, and supporting economic growth. And this rethinking needs to extend to policy instruments. So fiscal policy is not just about reducing government deficits. It's about the quest for full employment, about supporting economic growth. Monetary policy is not just a means of combating inflation through interest rates. It's a very potent instrument using the volume and price of credit to support growth. In other words, macro policies should not be about the short term alone, but must be something that is consistent with long-term development objectives. Second, there are important lessons to be learned from the experience of financial deregulation and capital account liberalization about what should not be done. Now, it's clearly essential to learn that financial deregulation, such as doing away with the distinction between banking and non-banking financial intermediaries, the Glass-Steagall Act in the United States, is fraught with risk. At the same time, in thinking of integrating into international financial markets, that it would be wise to hasten slowly with capital account liberalization. For the same reason, it is unwise to rely on portfolio investment flows to finance current account deficits, because portfolio investment represents the intersection of two somewhat thin, very unstable markets in developing countries, even emerging economies, namely foreign exchange markets and stock exchange markets. Third, it is essential to rethink the relative importance of the external and the internal in the process of development. We need to recognize that the domestic market is critical in the process of development, and external markets are at best complements, but cannot be substitutes for domestic markets, even in smaller countries. Of course, the validity of my argument does depend on the size of the country. Even so, domestic markets are at one level constitutive of development, because it means that ordinary people have the purchasing power, and at another level, instrumental in the process of development, because they can drive processes of growth. So wages are costs on the supply side. Everyone worries about that. But wages are also income on the demand side, which can support growth. Okay? Now, let me turn to my fourth and last question before I conclude with India. Is it then possible to speculate or hypothesize about the future of emerging economies in the world economy? Now, there are underlying factors which suggest a strong potential for growth, but there are also real constraints on future growth. There's the good news and the bad news. The economic determinants of potential growth in emerging economies are a source of good news. And in principle, these countries may be able to not just maintain and sustain high rates of growth for some times to come, for the following reasons. First, their population size is large, which is a possible source of growth, and their income levels are low, which means that the possibilities of growth are that much greater. Second, their demographic characteristics, in particular, the high proportion of the young in the population, and that's beginning to change in China slowly, would mean an increase in their workforce for some time to come, which are both conducive to growth, provided that these countries spread education to create capabilities amongst people. Third, their wages are significantly lower than in the world outside, even if rising, which is an important source of competitiveness in manufacturing activities, which, while there are large reservoirs of labor in China and India even now, that means that relatively low wages would continue to be a source of competitiveness for some time. And fourth, the potential for productivity increase is considerable at lower levels of productivity to start with. Now, in practice, emerging economies may not be able to realize this fantastic potential. There are specific constraints in specific countries. There are general constraints in most of them. In China, the declining productivity of investment at the margin or the sustainability of the political system are both possible constraints. In India, the crisis in agriculture, the bottlenecks in infrastructure, and the limited spread of education in society are enormous constraints. In Brazil, the uncertainty about prices of primary commodities, rising capital output ratios, insufficient employment creation are all constraints. And there are other constraints which are not discernible yet, may arise from growth. Economic exclusion, social conflict, environmental stress, and climate change. The fundamental constraint on sustainable export growth, beyond all these, in my view, in the long term, is the increasing economic inequality among people and between regions in emerging economies. In the pursuit of development, I think that poverty eradication, employment creation, and inclusive growth are imperative. For one, these are constitutive as essential objectives of development and of growth. Second, it's the only sustainable way forward for emerging economies because it would enable them to mobilize their most abundant resource, people, at low wages, for the purpose of development and to reinforce the process of growth through cumulative causation. Therefore, emerging economies, if they are to succeed, have to combine the process of growth with human development and social progress. If such a reality unfolds, these emerging economies not just can, but will provide a significant impetus to the growth process in their respective regions and in the world. And it would be an important complement in driving global growth as the engines of growth slow down elsewhere. Now, in conclusion, and I will stop in 3 minutes, just to flag some important issues about India. Professor Leung talked about China. That was his focus. Now, I believe that in the long term, India has enormous potential for economic growth and for social development. And I believe that in this process, the reason for my optimism lies not so much in what we see in its economy today, but in political democracy, which provides the checks and balances to India. But in thinking about India, if we think about the short-term outlook, there is reason for concern. There is a slowdown in growth. There's a stifling of investment, which is a function of high interest rates and eroding confidence. There's persistent inflation, close to double-digit levels. There's a massive balance of trade deficit at 10% of GDP and current account deficit at 5% of GDP. And there is, in my view, an impending macroeconomic crisis unless we act here and now. In a medium-term perspective, and that is the real thing, the first can be addressed. It just needs a smart government that can act. The medium-term perspective, the reasons for concern are A, jobless growth. Rates of growth in India are high, but employment creation is very slow. Poverty persists. It's not just those who are below $1.25 PPP per day, that may be 33% of the population. It's those who are below $2 PPP per day, that may be 75% of the population. And they are vulnerable to anything, a bad harvest, high inflation, higher oil prices. Now this is juxtaposed with a rising inequality, with the emergence of what Tony Atkinson and associates call the super rich or the ultra rich, the richest, not the richest 1%, but 1/10 of 1% of the population. And in the long-term horizon, and perhaps we could take that up in discussion, I worry about the deep crisis in agriculture. It accounts for only 15% of GDP, but supports more than 2/3 of the population, directly or indirectly. I worry about the crisis in infrastructure. We haven't got our act together. And I worry about the crisis in education. The demographic dividend, which everybody hopes for, would simply vanish into thin air unless we are able, through a spread of education in society, able to create the possibility and capabilities among people. Let me conclude about India. I'd be happy to continue in the discussion. Thank you.